They broke the oldest law in the galaxy. Do not threaten humans. The chamber was already too quiet when Underlord Jeth opened his mouth. I noticed it before he finished his first sentence. The Therial delegation, 3 rows to my left, stopped moving entirely. Not politely still. The way diplomats go still when they want to appear attentive. Frozen still. The kind of stillness that comes from a very old species recognizing something very dangerous. I was sitting at the back of the human table, behind Ambassador Nora Vance, holding a stylus and a notepad I had not written anything on in the past 4 minutes. The session was supposed to be about grain corridor rights along the outer reach. It had been about grain corridor rights for 11 days. Tedious, grinding, procedural work that I actually did not mind, because tedious and grinding meant nobody was threatening anybody. Underlord Jeth was about to change that. He was tall, the way all Vreth were tall, with that particular gray-green coloring across his upper face that senior Vreth officials developed after years of high-altitude atmospheric exposure. His translator collar was calibrated for conclave standard, which meant every word he said reached every delegation in perfect clarity. There was no ambiguity, no room to later claim mistranslation. He said, "The Vreth Dominion formally advises the human delegation that failure to accept our proposed corridor terms within 48 hours will result in the following: economic interdiction of human trade vessels operating in the outer reach, forward military positioning along the boundary markers of the Andavar corridor, and the temporary assumption of administrative sovereignty over the human colonial settlements of Kira Station, Port Saline, and the Devon agricultural colony. These are not proposals, they are scheduled actions." He then sat down, adjusted his collar, and looked at Nora Vance the way someone looks at a problem they believe they have just solved. The room did not react the way rooms react when a bold move lands well. Nobody shifted forward with interest. Nobody murmured in surprise. The Yesen bloc, who had been arguing loudly with the Vreth about something entirely separate for 6 days, went silent in a way that made the silence feel physical. The Karun observer, who was not even part of this session and had no vote on anything being discussed, slowly leaned back in his chair until it touched the wall. Ambassador Nora Vance closed her folder. She did not look up. She did not look at Zeeth. She closed her folder, placed her hands flat on the table, and said nothing. I set my stylus down beside my notepad. The conclave chamber was a large circular space, built to seat 47 delegations simultaneously, with tiered observation galleries that could hold 200 additional representatives from associate and observer species. The ceiling was domed, pale, and designed to carry sound evenly to every point in the room. Every word Zeth had said had reached every ear in the building with equal clarity. The silence that followed lasted 11 seconds. I counted. Zeth waited for a response. He received a second of silence, then a third. The Vreth aide beside him leaned over and whispered something. Zeth's expression did not change, but he glanced at Nora Vance with the first trace of something that might have been uncertainty. Nora Vance still had not spoken. I had worked with Nora for 4 years. I had seen her in arguments that lasted 8 hours without resolution. I had seen her in sessions where the other delegation insulted the human species generally, and the conclave charter specifically in the same sentence. I had never seen her go this still. She was not frightened. I want to be clear about that, because the Vreth absolutely misread it as fear. She was not frightened. She was deciding something. And when Nora Vance decided something, she did not rush. The conclave session moderator, a senior Therial official named Porvan, who had been running conclave sessions for what I understood to be approximately 230 years, cleared his throat with a sound like dry paper tearing. He announced a mandatory 20-minute recess for procedural clarity. It was the fastest recess call I had ever seen him make. The room began to move. Delegations pushed back chairs, gathered materials, murmured to their aides. Every single non-Vreth delegation was moving faster than normal. Not running, nothing so obvious. But the pace in that room, as people filed toward the corridor, had a quality I can only describe as carefully controlled urgency. I picked up my notepad, capped my stylus, and followed Nora toward the corridor door. Just before we reached it, she spoke to me without turning her head. She said, Get Ambassador Orvan. Tell him I would like 2 minutes. Quietly. I said, yes, Ambassador. She said, and send the record home. I said, already done. She nodded once and went to find water. I had sent the session record to Earth the moment Zieth finished speaking. It was not a decision I had to think about. The moment those words cleared his translator collar, the moment that sentence about colonial sovereignty left his mouth and entered the conclave's official audio record, I had flagged the clip, attached the timestamp, and transmitted it through our encrypted relay. The whole thing took perhaps 15 seconds. I had been trained for exactly that situation, in the hope that it would never actually occur. It had occurred. I went to find Ambassador Orvan. The corridor outside the conclave chamber was wide, gray, and functional, lined with seating alcoves designed for exactly this kind of between-session conversation. Orvan was already there, standing near the far end of the corridor with his hands clasped at his back, looking at the wall as if he were reading something written there that only he could see. He was the oldest active diplomat in the conclave. The Therial were not the oldest spacefaring species, but they were close, and Orvan personally had been serving in conclave functions for longer than some civilizations had possessed interstellar travel. He was not physically imposing. He was actually quite small, with a careful, measured quality to every movement he made, as though he had learned long ago that energy was not something to be wasted. I approached him and relayed Nora's message. He looked at me for a moment before answering. Not at my face, exactly. More like at the space around me, the way someone looks when they are thinking, and have simply pointed their eyes in your direction. He said, she wants to know what I remember. I said she wanted 2 minutes. He said, she wants to know what I remember. He paused. Tell her I will give her everything she needs, and tell her that from where I am standing, 41 years from now, the Vreth Dominion will look very different than it does today. I wrote that down, word for word, because something in the way he said it made me want to have it in writing. I went to find Nora, back inside the chamber, with 10 minutes left in the recess. The Vreth delegation was speaking quietly among themselves with the posture of people who believed they had won something. Zieth was reviewing documents. His aide was drafting something on a tablet. One of the junior Vreth officials was actually smiling. They had mistaken the silence for agreement. They had mistaken Nora's stillness for acceptance. They had mistaken 47 delegations going very, very quiet for submission. I sat back down at my seat, opened my notepad, and wrote the time at the top of a clean page. Then I wrote, Day 1. 11 seconds of silence in a room full of species who had been traveling the stars for thousands of years. 11 seconds was, it turned out, exactly how long it took for every experienced diplomat in that chamber to understand that the Vreth Dominion had just made the single worst mistake available to them. I was 29 years old. I had been a diplomatic attaché for 4 years. I had read the histories. I had passed every exam. I had sat through the briefings. But sitting in that room, watching Orvan stand in the corridor and stare at a wall like someone reading a future book that had already been decided, I understood for the first time that the histories were not warnings. They were records. Records of what happened to species that forgot the rule. The rule that every civilization eventually learned, usually from someone else's example, sometimes from their own. The rule that nobody had ever felt the need to write into the conclave charter, because the species that needed to read it had all, sooner or later, encountered a demonstration so complete and so final that no written version was necessary. The rule that the Vreth Dominion had just, in front of 47 delegations and 200 observers, chosen to break. I picked up my stylus. I wrote, at the top of the page, below the timestamp, "Do not threaten humans." Then I underlined it. Then I waited for what came next. The recess ended and the Vreth still had not grasped what they had done. I watched Zieth return to his seat with the walk of someone who had spent the break congratulating himself. His aide had that particular tight-faced expression that junior officials get when they are trying to look composed because they believe something significant has been achieved. The 2 Vreth observers in the upper gallery were leaning forward with what I recognized, from briefing files on Vreth body language, as anticipation. They expected capitulation. They expected Nora Vance to return to the table and begin negotiating the terms of the terms, which is the diplomatic way of beginning to agree to something you do not want to agree to. Nora returned to the table and sat down without opening her folder. Porvan called the session back to order in his dry paper voice and asked if the human delegation wished to respond to the Vreth proposal. Nora said, "The human delegation has received the Vreth statement and is considering its position. We have no further remarks at this time." Jeth blinked. Just once, but I caught it. He had expected arguments. He had expected counteroffers. He had expected the specific type of human diplomatic language that signals distress without admitting it. What he got was 5 sentences that meant precisely nothing, which in diplomatic terms means everything. The session moved on to minor procedural matters. Nora sat through all of them with the same flat attention she gave everything, which was her ordinary manner, and told me she was fine. And also told the entire room that she was not going to be rushed. When the session closed for the day, I walked with her through the conclave's east corridor toward the transport hub. We did not speak until we were past the last public seating area and into the section used only by delegations with security clearance. She said, "What did Orvan tell you?" I repeated his words exactly. She walked for a few seconds without responding. Then she said, 41 years. I said, "That's what he said." She said, optimistic. I did not ask what she meant. Our quarters were in the human delegation wing, 2 floors above the main chamber complex. I had a small room with a desk, a narrow window that looked out over the conclave's orbital dock arrays, and a secure terminal that connected to Earth's diplomatic relay through 3 separate encryption layers. I sat at the desk and opened the relay. There was a reply waiting. 4 words. We heard. Stand by. I read them twice. Then I closed the relay and went to get something to eat. Because in my experience, stand by always means several days of waiting, and there is no reason to do that on an empty stomach. The next morning I went looking for Ambassador Orvan. I found him in the conclave's public archive gallery, which was a long room on the 3rd floor that most delegations used as a quiet space to think, and a few actually used for its stated purpose of reviewing historical records. Orvan was doing the latter. He was seated at a reading terminal with a display open to something I could not immediately identify, and he looked up when I entered with the expression of someone who had been expecting me. I sat across from him and asked, without any introduction, because Orvan was the kind of person who found introductions unnecessary, what he remembered about the last time a species had publicly threatened humans at the conclave level. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The Dendari Compact, 412 years ago." He said it the way people say the name of something that no longer exists. I said, "What happened?" He looked at his display and then back at me. He said that the Dendari Compact had been a mid-tier interstellar power with strong military capability and a long-standing territorial dispute with 2 human colonies, along what was then the outer edge of human expansion. The dispute had been going through conclave arbitration for 6 years. The Compact had grown frustrated with the pace of arbitration and the refusal of the human colonies to accept reduced land grants as a compromise. At a full conclave session, their senior delegate had stood up and announced that if the colonies did not vacate within 90 days, the Compact would remove them by force. I asked what the human response was. Orvan said that the human delegation had thanked the Compact delegate for the clarity of the statement and requested an adjournment. The adjournment was granted. The humans left the chamber. They did not return for 11 days. When they returned, they brought with them a legal filing of approximately 900 pages addressed to the Conclave Secretariat, a set of economic notices filed through every interstellar banking institution that recognized Conclave authority, and a quiet repositioning of assets that the Compact's intelligence services only partially mapped in the weeks that followed. The Compact did not remove the colonies. The Compact did not launch a military operation. The Compact spent the next 7 years in a state of managed economic and diplomatic isolation, from which it emerged significantly smaller, permanently restructured, and without the territorial claims that had started the dispute. No engagement took place between human and Compact military forces at any point during the process. I wrote all of this down. Orvan watched me write and then said, "There are 2 other cases I can describe in similar detail. The Mara Collective, the Oran Federation, both within the last 3 centuries. The pattern is consistent." I said, "Consistent how?" he said. The threatening party always believes the silence is hesitation. It is not hesitation. It is preparation. I wrote that down too, he said. The Vreth are not unintelligent. They are simply young by the standards of this chamber. They have been a space-capable civilization for approximately 400 years. They have fought wars and won some of them. They understand power in the way young species understand power, which is to say they understand the visible kind. He paused. Humans have been here long enough to become fluent in the other kind. I asked him why the rule was not in the charter, why the conclave had never formally codified it. He looked at me with something that might have been amusement, and might have been something sadder. He said, because a rule written in a charter can be argued with, a demonstration cannot. I closed my notepad and thanked him. He said, as I stood to leave, your ambassador is very calm, I said. She usually is. He said, calm at the beginning means they have already thought past the end. The Vreth have not thought past tomorrow. That is the difference. I walked back to the delegation wing, thinking about what the Dendari Compact had looked like 400 years ago, before it made a decision in an open session, and discovered that the silence it had mistaken for weakness was something else entirely. On the morning of day 3, the Vreth made their first attempt to create pressure. It came through the conclave's procedural channel, which is the administrative system used to schedule sessions, file motions, and raise points of order. The Vreth filed a formal procedural notice, stating that the human delegation had failed to respond to a time-sensitive proposal, and requesting that the conclave secretariat issue a timeline compliance notice. A compliance notice is essentially a bureaucratic nudge. It has no enforcement mechanism. It exists to create a paper trail that suggests the requesting party is being reasonable and the other party is being obstructive. It is the kind of filing that junior delegations use when they want to apply pressure without sufficient standing to do anything more significant. The conclave secretariat acknowledged receipt and forwarded it to the human delegation. Nora read it, set it aside, and asked me to make sure it was included in the growing record file. I included it in the growing record file. The growing record file was now 43 pages long and contained the original session transcript, a time-stamped audio record of Zeth's statement, the formal conclave session log confirming its official status, Orvan's historical briefing in summarized form, and now the procedural notice and the Secretariat's acknowledgement of it. I sent an updated copy to Earth. The reply came back in 8 hours, which was faster than I expected. 3 words, noted. Continue documenting. On day 4, Nora Vance spoke to Zeth directly for the first time since the session. Not in a formal setting. In the corridor outside the Translation Services office, where both delegations happened to be at the same time. I was with Nora. Zeth's aide was with him. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. Zeth said that the Dominion's position remained unchanged, and that the 48-hour window had technically passed, although the Dominion was prepared to extend it by an additional 72 hours as a gesture of goodwill. Nora said, "That is very kind," and then she turned and continued down the corridor toward the translation office. Zeth stood in the corridor for a moment. His aide said something to him in Vreth. I did not catch all of it, but I caught the tone, which was confused. They had expected her to negotiate the extension. They had expected her to use the extended window as an opening. Instead, she had thanked them for it and walked away. I made a note of the exchange, the time, the exact phrasing, and included it in the record. On day 5, Earth's full response arrived. It was not a message. It was a filing. 1,217 pages, submitted directly to the Conclave Secretariat under the Covenant of Declared Intent, which was a treaty instrument so old that 3 of the species who had originally signed it no longer existed as distinct political entities. The Covenant was the mechanism through which the Conclave formally registered acts of declared hostility against member or associate civilizations, created the legal basis for protective economic measures, and triggered the review processes that governed what happened next. The human filing named the Vreth Dominion by name. It included a full transcript of Zeth's statement. It included the session log. It included the audio record with timestamp. It included the procedural history of the grain corridor dispute going back 9 months. It included economic analysis of the Vreth Dominion's trade dependency on human-administered corridor infrastructure, which turned out to be a document I found personally fascinating. The Vreth, in the 400 years since they had achieved interstellar travel, had quietly built a substantial portion of their trade logistics on routes that passed through or adjacent to space that humans administered, not because anyone had planned it that way. Because humans had been in those regions first, and had built the infrastructure that made trade efficient, and efficient infrastructure gets used by whoever needs it, regardless of who built it. The analysis estimated that approximately 61% of the Vreth Dominion's non-military interstellar cargo moved through or near human-administered corridor space. 61%. I read that number 3 times. Then I read the section that explained what happened to that cargo under the Covenant of Declared Intent. Once a filing was accepted by the Secretariat, it did not get blockaded by warships. It got suspended by paperwork. Every transit permit, every corridor access agreement, every logistical arrangement that passed through human-administered space went into formal review status. Not canceled, not seized, reviewed. Which meant, in practice, that no cargo moved while the review was pending, because no operator runs cargo under a permit that is under formal review, because no insurer covers cargo moving under a reviewed permit, because no port accepts cargo that arrives under reviewed documentation. The whole system simply stopped. Not with a bang, not with a fleet. With 1,217 pages, and the oldest treaty instrument in the Audit Conclave. I went to Nora's office and knocked on the open door. She was reading the filing summary on her terminal. She had a coffee in her hand, and she did not look up when I came in. I said, "Has the Secretariat acknowledged receipt?" She said, "4 hours ago." I said, "When will they serve notice to the Vreth delegation?" She said, "They already have." She turned her terminal so I could see the screen. There was a Secretariat notification on it, time-stamped 40 minutes prior, confirming that the Vreth Dominion had been formally served under the Covenant, and that the review process was now active. I said, "What happens now?" Nora said, "Now we wait for them to understand what they stepped into." She took a sip of her coffee. I said, "Should I be somewhere specific?" She said, "Get some rest. Tomorrow is going to be a long session." She was right. The next morning's session was the longest I had attended since arriving at the conclave. It ran for 6 hours with 2 short breaks. Sheth spent the first hour demanding that the Secretariat explain the filing. The Secretariat spent the next 30 minutes explaining it. Sheth spent the following 90 minutes arguing that it was an overreach, a violation of proportionality, a misuse of the Covenant, and an act of economic hostility that was more extreme than any threat his delegation had made. Porvan listened to all of it with 200 years of practiced patience. Then Nora Vance requested the floor. Porvan gave it to her. She stood up and she said one sentence. She said, "The human delegation formally requests that the conclave note we have taken no military action and intend none at this time, at this time." Those 3 words. I watched Zeth's aide process them. I watched the aide write something down and slide it across the table to Zeth. I watched Zeth read it. I watched his posture change by approximately 2 degrees, which on a Vreth is the equivalent of a human going visibly pale. At this time meant something specific. It meant that the current situation was the non-military version of the response. It meant there was another version that had not been deployed. It meant that every economic and procedural measure currently in effect was the floor, not the ceiling. Zeth asked for a recess. Porvan granted it. I went to get coffee, because by that point I had been sitting in a hard chair for 4 hours and I had earned it. On the morning of day 8, the Vreth made a decision that told me everything I needed to know about how badly they were panicking. They went shopping. Not literally. They went looking for allies. I found out because Orvan told me. He came to find me in the archive gallery, which had apparently become our unofficial meeting location, and sat across from me with the precise movements of someone who has something to report and wants to report it accurately. He said that in the past 48 hours, the Vreth delegation had made informal contact with the representatives of 3 separate conclave member species, the Yesen Bloc, the Karung Assembly, and the Pallid Reaches. In each case, the contact had involved a private meeting, an offer of expanded trade terms, and a request for a statement of support in the context of the current covenant review. I said, "What did they say?" He said, "The Yesen bloc declined without giving a reason. The Karun Assembly said they were not in a position to comment on active covenant proceedings. The Pallid Reaches said they would be happy to discuss trade arrangements and had no opinion on conclave procedural matters." He paused, which is the diplomatic way of saying no in a manner that leaves the door open for later. I said, "None of them." He said, "None of them." He considered for a moment. "I want you to understand something. The Yesen bloc has been in a territorial dispute with the human colonies along the meridian line for 19 years. The Karun Assembly does not recognize 3 of the human boundary declarations in the outer sectors. The Pallid Reaches have filed 4 formal protests against human commercial operations in their adjacent space in the last decade alone." He looked at me steadily. "None of them agreed to help the Vreth." I let that sit for a moment. He said, "It is not fondness for humans. You understand that. It is the same calculation every species makes when they see something like this beginning. Nobody wants to be standing next to the Vreth when the accounting finishes." I said, "The Dendari Compact," he said, "among others." I said, "Is there any scenario where the Vreth find a meaningful coalition?" He was quiet for long enough that I almost repeated the question. Then he said, "In theory, any outcome is possible. In practice, you would need a species willing to match what humanity can bring to an extended conflict, willing to absorb the economic costs of the Covenant's secondary provisions, and willing to bet that the outcome would be worth more than the relationship they would permanently destroy by making that bet. There is no such species currently seated in this chamber." He folded his hands on the table. "The Vreth are alone. They have been alone since the moment Zeth finished his sentence. They simply do not know it yet." I wrote all of this down. Then I sent it home. The reply came back in 5 hours. Thorough. Continue. On day 10, the Vreth tried something more direct. It started with a message to the human delegation's communications channel, formally addressed to me by name, from the office of Underlord Zeth's senior aide, a Vreth official whose name translated to something approximately like Coordinator Devith. The message stated that an administrative review of my diplomatic credentials had identified a discrepancy in my registration filing from 14 months prior, and that the Conclave's procedural office had been notified. I read the message twice. The discrepancy, when I pulled my registration file and checked it against the Conclave's own records, did not exist. My registration was clean. Every date, every credential, every counter-signature was correctly filed and correctly logged. There was no discrepancy. What there was a message from the Vreth trying to manufacture one. I forwarded the message, my registration file, and the Conclave's own registration log showing my credentials as verified and current to 3 places: the Conclave Secretariat's procedural office, Earth's diplomatic relay, and our record file, which was now 104 pages long. The Secretariat's procedural office responded within 2 hours, confirming that my registration was fully compliant and that no review had been initiated from their end. I added that response to the record file. The next morning, there was an incident outside the delegation guest quarters. I say incident because that is the neutral term. What actually happened was that I was walking back from the East Wing cafeteria with a container of very bad coffee and 2 sandwiches, when I noticed a Vreth security official, identifiable by their rank badge and the particular shade of their uniform, standing in the corridor approximately 40 meters from the human delegation wing entrance. They were not doing anything. They were standing there, watching. I made eye contact, nodded once, and went inside. I reported the presence to Nora, documented it with a timestamp and description, added it to the record file, and then ate one of the sandwiches because I was genuinely hungry, and there was nothing else immediately actionable to do. On day 12, the Vreth attempted the credential challenge through the Conclave's formal procedural channel, this time citing a different alleged discrepancy in the registration of a junior member of our translation team, a young woman named Kara Page, who had been with the delegation for 7 months, and whose paperwork was, I had personally verified, completely correct. That filing went into the record file too. We now had 2 manufactured procedural complaints, 1 documented surveillance presence in the corridor, a formal covenant filing, the original session record, and 131 pages of supporting documentation. Nora reviewed the record file that evening. She read through the new additions without visible reaction. Then she said, "They're trying to create pressure through small things because the large thing isn't working." I said, "It's not working either," she said. "No. But it tells us something useful." I said, "What?" She said, "Panic looks like this. It looks like small moves. When you have a strong position, you make large moves confidently. When you don't, you make small ones quickly. They're scrambling." She closed the record file. She said, "Make sure the credential challenge filings and the corridor incident are both clearly documented as part of the VRETH response pattern. Separately sourced, separately time-stamped. I want it obvious that they form a sequence." On day 14, Jeth moved warships. Not into human space. Not even close to human space. He moved 3 VRETH military vessels to the outer edge of the Selene colonial region's long-range sensor envelope, which put them approximately 9 light minutes from the nearest human colony's detection range. Far enough to claim they were not a provocation. Close enough to appear on every scan. It was meant to be visible. That was the entire point. 3 ships sitting at the edge of sensor range, doing nothing, being seen. I was in the archive gallery when the alert came through on my relay unit. I read it, forwarded it to Nora with the coordinates and timestamp, and waited. Nora's reply came back in 11 minutes. She said, "Noted. Include in record." From Earth, nothing came that day. Or the next. On day 16, I was eating breakfast in the East Wing cafeteria when my relay unit produced 3 short signals in rapid succession, which is the code our communication system uses when a priority message arrives. I set down my food and opened it. It was a navigation notice from Earth's Conclave Liaison Office, copied to our delegation as a matter of record. Standard format. Routine language. Listing updated transit coordinates for a number of vessels in the Outer Reach region. 17 vessels. I read the coordinates. They were not in human space. They were not near the VRETH ships. They were in 17 separate locations that formed, if you plotted them on a chart of the relevant sector, a net. Not surrounding the VRETH ships. Not threatening them. Just positioned. Watching from positions that the VRETH ships would now know were occupied and had not previously mapped. The navigation notice had been transmitted on a frequency the VRETH's long-range monitoring systems would detect. That was not an accident. I finished my breakfast. I went to find Nora. She was already at her desk with the navigation notice open on her terminal. She said, 17. I said, yes. She said, the VRETH had 3. I said, yes. She did not say anything else for a moment. Then she said, how long do you think before they pull their ships back? I said, I think by morning. She said, give them the full day. They'll want to believe it was their own decision. She was right. By the following afternoon, all 3 VRETH ships had returned to their regular patrol positions. No announcement was made. No statement was issued. They simply went back to where they had been before Jeth decided to make a visible point. No human ship moved in response. The 17 vessels remained where they were. That was important too. Presence is different from aggression. The VRETH had made a gesture with 3 ships that said, look what we have. Earth had made a reply with 17 ships that said we were already here. The difference between those 2 things was not about numbers. It was about what the numbers meant. 3 ships sent to be seen is theater. 17 ships already in place is infrastructure. I added the navigation notice, the VRETH ship movement, and the return to position all to the record file, now 162 pages long, and sent an updated copy to Earth. The reply came back the same evening, 2 words, well documented. On day 19, the VRETH economy began producing visible distress signals. I had been tracking the public data available through the Conclave's open financial monitoring system, which exists because the Conclave believes economic transparency among members reduces the motivation for certain kinds of conflict. The VRETH Dominion's publicly reported trade figures showed a gap forming in their logistics chain. Cargo that should have been moving was not moving. Shipment completion rates for the VRETH's outer sector supply lines, which depended on corridor transit through human-adjacent space, had dropped by approximately 38% in the 10 days since the Covenant filings review provisions had taken effect. 38% is not a crisis. But it is also not nothing. It is the kind of number that gets attention in budget meetings and guild halls and agricultural distribution centers. It is the kind of number that has a name in Vreth communities who rely on imported seed stock and medical supplies and manufactured components. On day 20, the first public statement from a Vreth commercial entity appeared in the Conclave's open press channel. The Vreth Merchant Navigation Guild issued a formal notice to its membership, copied to the Conclave Secretariat, expressing concern about the current disruption to corridor transit and requesting that the relevant parties pursue resolution through all available diplomatic channels with appropriate urgency. The Guild was not addressing humans. They were addressing their own government. The Vreth Agricultural Importers Collective issued a similar notice. On day 23, the Vreth Fuel and Energy Consortium's quarterly statement included a paragraph about logistical uncertainty that, read carefully, was a request for the government to fix the situation. None of these entities had been involved in Z's threat. None of them had voted for it or approved it or wanted it. The grain corridor dispute was between governments and military planners and the kind of senior official who gets to make decisions that other people live with. The other people were now living with it. I compiled the public statements, the trade figures, and the timeline into a supplementary section of the record file and noted, for the record, that the current disruption had been produced entirely by the Covenant's review mechanism, which was a provision that had existed in the treaty for 4 centuries and had been applied in exactly the correct manner, according to its own terms. No sanctions, no punishments, no retaliatory actions, just a review, a very expensive review. On day 26, Zeth requested a private session with Nora Vance. Nora agreed to a formal session, not private, formal, with the session logged and the Conclave Secretariat notified. Zeth arrived at the session room with his 2 most senior aides, and a document I could see was prepared in advance. He sat down across from Nora with the particular posture of someone who has decided to be reasonable and wants to credit for it. He said that the Dominion remained firm in its position, that the Covenant filing was a disproportionate response to a diplomatic communication that had been, perhaps, more strongly worded than was strictly necessary, but that the Dominion was prepared to discuss a path toward resolution if the human delegation was also prepared to discuss the underlying corridor, gestor access issues that had created the original dispute. Nora said, "What would resolution look like, from the Dominion's perspective?" Zeth said, "A mutual withdrawal of the current measures, a return to the arbitration table with a fresh calendar, and no preconditions." Nora said, "And the statement made in session on day 1, Zeth said, could be addressed as part of the broader resolution framework." Nora said, "No." Zeth waited. Nora said, "The statement made in session on day 1 is not a component of the broader resolution framework. It is a threshold condition that must be addressed before any broader framework can exist. The Covenant filing remains active until the threshold condition is met. The threshold condition is a formal, public, complete withdrawal of the threat, delivered in open session before the full conclave, with acknowledgement of the Covenant violation and agreement to 10 years of trade practice oversight." Zeth said, "That is not resolution, that is surrender." Nora said, "It is the terms." The session ended 17 minutes after it began. I walked out with Nora and she said nothing until we were back in the delegation wing. Then she said, "He'll be back. He just needs to understand that the terms are not going to change." I said, "How long do you think?" She said, "Until the pressure at home is louder than his preference to avoid public acknowledgement." She was right about that too. On day 30, 3 separate Vreth civic organizations filed public petitions demanding government accountability for the trade disruption. The Vreth Dominion's internal legislative assembly, which was not a particularly powerful body under the Dominion's governance structure, passed a non-binding resolution urging the executive to pursue a diplomatic resolution to the current conclave situation through whatever means were available. Non-binding resolutions in governing bodies that do not usually produce them are not actually non-binding. They are signals. They are the institutional version of the pressure Nora had been waiting for. On day 35, Zeth's office sent a formal communication to the Conclave Secretariat requesting guidance on the procedural requirements for making a formal community statement under the Covenant of Declared Intents resolution provisions. That message, when I read it, made me feel something I can only describe as quiet satisfaction. Not triumph, not pride. Just the particular calm that comes from watching a very long process arrive at the destination it was always heading toward. I added the message to the record file. The file was 208 pages long. On day 38, Zueth met with Nora again. This session was also formal, also logged. He arrived without his senior aides, just one junior official, and the session record keeper. He said that the Dominion wished to understand the complete requirements for a statement under the resolution provisions. Nora provided them in full, without abbreviation, without negotiation, without softening. Zueth listened to all of it. Then he said, "And after the statement is made, and the oversight period begins, the review is fully lifted," Nora said. "And there are no additional conditions," she said. "No." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The corridor access dispute," she said, "returns to arbitration with a fresh calendar, as you proposed. We have no objection to that," he said. "On what terms?" she said. "The standard terms. No preconditions." He nodded. One short, precise nod. Then he said, "I will need 3 days." Nora said, "Of course." He stood, gathered nothing because he had brought nothing, and left. Nora and I sat in the session room for a moment after he was gone. Then she said, "Get some sleep. Day 41 is going to be well attended." The conclave chamber had not been that full since the year before I arrived, when the Karun Assembly and the Yesen Bloc had both been on the edge of something that required every available diplomat to prevent it from becoming irreversible. Every seat was filled. The observation galleries were at capacity. Delegations that had not sent representatives to a standard session in years had sent them today. I counted 11 species in the upper gallery who had observer status only, and no formal vote on anything currently before the conclave. They were there to watch. That was the only reason to be there when you had no vote. I sat at the back of the human table, behind Nora, with my notepad and my stylus. I had slept reasonably well. I had eaten breakfast. I had made sure the complete record file was transmitted to Earth the previous evening, with a note flagging the expected session and its likely content. Earth's reply had come back overnight. Received. Well done. 2 words at the start, 2 words at the end. Porvan called the session to order in his dry paper voice. Underlord Zueth stood. He stood for a moment with both hands flat on the table in front of him. And then he began. He spoke for 12 minutes. He began with the formal identification required under the Covenant's resolution provisions. Date, session number, parties, relevant Covenant clauses. He confirmed that the statement he was about to make was made voluntarily, without duress, with full authority from the Vreth Dominion's executive, and was being entered into the permanent conclave record. Then he withdrew the threat, every clause of it, every element, the economic interdiction language, the military positioning announcement, the sovereignty declaration over Kira Station, Port Saline, and the Devan agricultural colony. He withdrew each one by name, in the language the Covenant required, with the acknowledgement language that left no room for later reinterpretation. He acknowledged the Covenant violation. He accepted the 10-year trade practice oversight provision. He completed every required element of the resolution statement. Then he sat down. The chamber was quiet, not the same quiet as day 1. Day 1 was the quiet of shock, of old species recognizing something dangerous beginning. This was different. This was the quiet of the same old species recognizing something completing, the sound of a process running to its natural end. The sound of the galaxy's oldest lesson being taught, again, to a species young enough to need it. Porvan confirmed receipt of the statement into the conclave's permanent record. He confirmed that the Covenant review process would begin its formal closeout procedure. He confirmed that the corridor arbitration calendar would be reset to standard terms. He did not editorialize. He did not add anything. He simply confirmed and moved on to the next item of business, which was a minor docking rights dispute between 2 species I had barely been following for the past 41 days. I wrote the time in my notepad. Day 41. Session complete. Nora Vance did not change her expression. She opened her folder to the next relevant document, which was the calendar reset confirmation she would need to sign when the session produced the administrative paperwork, and she reviewed it with the same flat attention she gave everything. I thought about 7 words sent through an encrypted relay on the first evening of all of this. Vreth, public threat, full record, your call, and 4 words back. We heard, stand by. That was the whole conversation. 12 words between Earth and 1 table in 1 chamber. And 41 days later, Underlord Jeth was standing in front of a full session reading required language into the permanent record. After the session, I walked out through the east corridor. I was thinking about the report I had to write. 41 pages at minimum. Meticulously sourced. Every exchange, every filing, every timestamp, every move and countermove and non-move that had made up the past 6 weeks. Ambassador Orvan found me near the corridor's end. He stood beside me and said nothing for a moment. We watched the delegations moving past. Then he said, I have seen 41 years become 41 days before. I should have trusted the number. I said, you said optimistic. He said, I was accounting for complications that did not materialize. I said, why didn't they? He thought about that. Then he said, because the Vreth are not unreasonable. They are simply inexperienced. There is a difference. Unreasonable species cannot be brought to a point like today. Inexperienced ones can, once they understand the full shape of what they stepped into. He paused. Zethada stood by day 3. The rest of the time was the Dominion catching up to him. I said, do you think they'll try something like this again? He said, no. Not them. Not this generation. He looked at the corridor ahead. But there is always another generation, and always another young species somewhere that has not yet found its lesson. Is that why the rule is never written down? So there's always a demonstration available for the ones who haven't seen it yet? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something I have thought about many times since. He said, the rule exists in its demonstrations. Every civilization that has seen it happen to another civilization remembers it. Every civilization that has lived through it remembers it better. The unwritten law is more powerful than the written one, because it cannot be argued with on a technicality, cannot be appealed through a procedural channel, and cannot be dismissed as outdated or overly broad. It simply is. It has been demonstrated. It will be demonstrated again, the next time someone forgets. He looked at me. The Vreth will not forget. But someone will, eventually. He said it without bitterness. Just as a fact, I said, and then it gets demonstrated again. He said, yes. I nodded. He nodded. We parted in the corridor, and I went back to the delegation wing to write my report. I sat at my desk and opened a new document. I wrote the date. I wrote the case reference number. I wrote the opening line. The Vreth Dominion issued a public threat against the human delegation in open conclave session on day 1 of the current reporting period. Then I wrote the next 40 pages. I was precise. I was thorough. I included every piece of documentation, every timestamp, every exchange, every filing and counterfiling, and procedural notice and navigation update, and commercial sector statement, and legislative resolution, and private session record. I included Orvan's historical briefing. I included the Dendari Compact. I included the Marek Collective and the Oran Federation. I included the navigation notice with the 17 vessels' coordinates. I included Zeeth's statement from the final session, in full. At the end, I wrote the summary line. No military action was taken. No direct engagement occurred. Standard resolution achieved through covenant mechanism and existing treaty infrastructure. All conditions met. Trade arbitration calendar reset. Case closed. I added one more line, which was not standard summary language, but which I included anyway because I believed it belonged there. The oldest rule in the galaxy remains unwritten and unbroken. I submitted the report to Earth's diplomatic archive. Then I closed the terminal, picked up my coffee, and went to find something to eat. Somewhere behind me, the conclave continued. The docking rights dispute between the two species I had barely been following for 6 weeks would probably run another 4 days. The Yesen block and the Therial were scheduling new sessions on the Meridian line. There were 17 other active files on Nora's calendar for the next month. The galaxy was very large and very old, and very full of civilizations at different points in the long process of figuring out where the lines were. Some of them would figure it out early, by watching. Some of them would figure it out the hard way, by doing what the Vreth had done. And some of them, a very few, would look at the record and still not quite believe it. Right up until the moment the Covenant filing landed on their secretariat desk and the paperwork began, and they realized, too late and too slowly, that the silence they had mistaken for hesitation was not hesitation at all. It never was. It was preparation. It was all